In wrestling, there have been a few who have been lucky enough, or unlucky enough, to have their name associated with a particular aspect of the industry over the years. We're talking about things like the gorilla position being named after Gorilla Monsoon, the Road Warrior pop taking its name from Hawk and Animal, or Dusty Rhodes giving his name to the Dusty finish. One unfortunate version of this, however, can be found in the term being the Janetty of a group, meaning to be the weaker half who fails to become a success on his own. But just who are the best examples of this in wrestling history? Well, that's exactly what we're going to be looking at right now, starting with the originator of the term, Marty Jannetty himself. Yes, never has a member of a successful tag team ever fallen so hard after the fact as Marty Jannetty did because, well, in large part because his partner just so happened to be Shawn Michaels, one of the greatest performers to ever lace up a pair of boots. But even if he hadn't been paired up with HBK, Janetty's failure to launch once the Rockers came to an end during the early 90s is still quite a tragedy on his part. And the reason we say this is because during the early days when the team were together back during the mid to late 80s, you could have argued that Marty was the better of the two. Sadly though, with Shawn quickly proving to be a prodigy in the ring and with Janetty's habit of partying to a level that would make even Keith Richards shudder, it wasn't long before this dynamic flipped and all of a sudden everyone was talking about Michaels as being the real big breakout star of the group. And that would only be solidified when, following their breakup in 1992, the showstopper rose up the ranks to the point where just a few years later, he'd be world champion, all while during that same period, Marty would get released from the company on multiple occasions. Could he have been more? Of course he could have. Sure, he was unlikely to be as great as Shawn Michaels by this point, but he could still have been a solid mid-card act. In the end, though, he'll always go down as wrestling's perennial Janetty, someone who's ahead of even our next subject in that respect, Jim Neidhart. That's right, we had to talk about this one next. After all, throughout pretty much the entirety of their careers, Shawn Michaels and Bret Hart would be so intertwined, it's almost impossible to think of one without thinking of the other. And that also applied to their tag team days too, because it was back in the late 80s that the Rockers found a pair of long-term rivals in the Hart Foundation. Who were the Hart Foundation made up of? Well, that would be Bret Hart and his brother-in-law, Jim the Anvil Neidhart. As you can imagine, though, there was only one person who was destined to become a superstar once this team finally went their separate ways, and it was obviously going to be the best there is, the best there was, and the best there ever will be. Seriously, you could make a solid argument that the Hitman is the greatest to ever lace up a pair of boots. And while Neidhart was good as a powerhouse of a team, outside of that, he was never a major singles star. So when the Hart Foundation split in 1991 and Bret found himself going from strength to strength as a solo act, Jim struggled to maintain his relevance, something he initially attempted to do by finding a new partner in Owen Hart. Once this ran its course though, it would be off to other places like WCW for the Anvil for a while, with him remaining there doing little of note right up until he returned to the WWF in the mid-90s. Of course, by now he wasn't even second place in the hierarchy of the new version of the Hart Foundation though. No, at best he was fourth behind Bret, Owen, and the British Bulldog. And at times he fell behind Brian Pillman in the pecking order, making him dead last in terms of importance. So it should come as no surprise that this run also saw the Californian do little of note, just as he would do little of note when he returned to WCW again after that and ran out what was left of his time in the big leagues. Yes, some people are just better suited to be tag team guys instead of singles guys, and the Anvil is most definitely one of them. But he's not alone in that. No, the exact same thing could be said about a lot of people, one of them being our next subject, none other than Stevie Ray. Yes, we're heading over to WCW for a while, as that's where we find one of the best tag teams of the 90s, Harlem Heat, the duo made up of Booker T and his real-life brother, Stevie Ray. So dominant were these two back in the day, so much were they able to run roughshod over the World Championship Wrestling locker room that by the time they called it a day and went their own separate ways once and for all in 2000, they'd be 10-time tag team champions. Of course, once they did split though, both siblings would not meet the same level of success. No, while Booker T would very quickly prove himself to be a major singles star, someone good enough to become a 5-time WCW champion, and the last man to hold that belt when the company went out of business in 2001, Stevie Ray's singles run would be a lot more muted in its nature. And that's because rather than win any singles gold or get involved in any notable singles feuds, he instead just sort of milled around as a member of the NWO B team. So when WWF bought out WCW then and began bringing over their roster to WWF, Stevie didn't even get a look in. No, well, his brother would go on to arguably even bigger success in the WWF, becoming a world champion all over again and a bona fide main event act. The New Yorker would instead be forced to work the indie circuit for a while, all the way up until he retired from full-time competition during the mid-2000s, in fact. That said, even if he never became much of anything on screen once Harlem Heat's fire died out, this isn't to say Stevie Ray made no contributions to the wrestling industry during his later years, because as it stands today, he's made the occasional appearance for Booker's Reality of Wrestling promotion in Houston, the very place that first introduced the world to stars of tomorrow like Roxanne Perez. No, we're not expecting this to lead to him making a full-time comeback anytime soon or anything like that. And we don't imagine it'll change anyone's minds about him being the Janetty of Harlem Heat because when you stack up his accomplishments next to those of the master of the Spinneroonie, there really is no comparison. That said, it shows that even if you are the Janetty of your team, you can still find some level of success. But let's move away from WCW for now and over to something closer to the present day instead, as it's there back over in WWE that we find our next great Janetty in the form of one half of another great brother tag team. That's right, it's time to talk about Jimmy Uso. Now, if we'd have said this as recently as 2019, then it would seem wild to think that Jimmy was the Janetty of the Usos, as back then he and his brother were on a pretty equal playing field. Hell, with them being identical twins and all, many fans would have struggled to tell them apart at a glance. But then it wasn't as if there was much on screen to separate them, as, from the point they debuted in 2010 right up until the end of the decade, they were exclusively a part of the WWE Tag Team division. And they certainly had a lot of success as part of a duo. Hell, as it stands today, they're one of the most decorated teams to ever set foot in the WWE, as over the course of their run, they've held tag team gold on 8 separate occasions, and even achieved the incredibly rare feat of main eventing WrestleMania as a pair. That said, once Jey Uso left the Bloodline in the summer of 2023 and decided to go over to Raw instead, separating himself from his brother in the process, he truly took off as a single star. That's right, this was the point Jey Uso fully became main event Jey Uso, a breakout babyface of Monday nights who would eventually go on to win the Royal Rumble in 2025. As to what happened to Jimmy Uso during this time, well, his run would be a lot less successful. Now, when it came to the older of the two twins, rather than getting a big singles push, he'd remain a member of Roman Reigns' heel group, with him at this point serving the role of lackey as designated pin eater to the entire operation. Why was this? Well, it seemed that when he wasn't aligned with his sibling, some of the magic was just missing from Jimmy Uso. And so as Jey was off becoming Intercontinental Champion, his appearances on TV were becoming sparser and sparser. And that's a pattern which has continued right up until the present day, to the point that while Jey looks like he might be main eventing WrestleMania against Gunther for the World Heavyweight title in 2025, Jimmy might not even make it onto the card at all. Really, there's no obvious place we can see for him there outside of maybe the Andre the Giant Memorial Battle Royal, a Battle Royal which is rarely, if ever, even on the actual Mania card anymore. And that leaves Jimmy, at least for the time being, sinking further into that role of being the Janetty of the Usos. But at least he's not alone in filling this role. Around the same time of their initial tag team rise, the same thing was happening to another lesser member of a duo, Devon Dudley. Of course, this isn't to suggest Devon didn't do some great stuff during his career, it's just that this stuff came when he was part of the Dudley Boys. Yes, it was while teaming with his kayfabe brother Bubba Ray in places like ECW, WWE, TNA, and even New Japan briefly that he dominated the tag team scene, so much so that by the time all was said and done, he'd be able to call himself a 23-time champion. But sadly for him, this success was never able to transfer over to the singles world, as whenever he tried his hand at that, he'd flop. And this goes all the way back to the early 2000s as well, the period where, once Bubba Ray and Devon were split up during the first WWE draft, he'd go on a lower card run as Reverend Devon on SmackDown, an evil priest whose most notable addition to the world of wrestling was that he was the man who first introduced us to Dave Bautista. And all the while he was doing this, his partner was finding more success as a singles act over on Raw. Needless to say that it was clear here that Devon missed Bubba Ray. And so, when they were reunited again later that year, it revived his career. But that wouldn't be the only time the Dudleys split. No, they do so all over again in TNA during the early 2010s when Bubba morphed into Bully Ray, his full-blown attempt to become a top guy in the singles division. How would this work out for both parties? Well, for Bully Ray, it would work out great as he'd go on to become a 2-time TNA World Champion and, at points, the de facto face of the company. As for Devon, though, well, he'd never reach these heights, and this would solidify his status as the Janetty of the team for the rest of time. But what about another of the all-time great tag teams, the Steiner brothers? Did they have a situation where one of them became the Janetty following their split? Why, yes they did, and that unfortunate member of the team would be none other than our next subject, Rick Steiner. Now y'all know the Steiner brothers for sure, and if you don't, then here's a brief rundown of their resume. Two-time WWF Tag Team Champions, two-time IWGP World Tag Team Champions, and 8-time Tag Team Champions across WCW in the National Wrestling Alliance. That said, for all the success they had as a pair, there was always a sense that, should they ever go their separate ways, then it would be Scott Steiner who would be the one getting the big singles push. And wouldn't you know it, this is exactly what happened during the late 90s. Sure, you could argue it was easier for Scott to find singles success here during the jacked-up physique era he was in when he transformed into his final form, but even if he hadn't done this, there was always something a little bit more special about him when compared to his brother, and that applied to both his in-ring style and his promo skills. Yes, the reality was that the big bad booty daddy just had the it factor which so many others don't, and this gave him an extra leg up in the singles scene. So it was then that in the years which followed, Scott Steiner would go on to become a world heavyweight champion, all while his brother was milling around doing little of note in the mid-card. Seriously, if he wasn't reuniting with his sibling, Rick was likely to be found struggling to stay afloat as he chased after lower card belts like the United States title. And that meant when WCW went under in 2001, it wouldn't be the dog-faced gremlin who got the call to come into the WWF and be a main event guy for a while. No, it would be Big Papa Pump instead. Hell, as things stand today, you could argue that even Rick's son Braun Breaker has outshone him, as he's one of the fastest rising stars in WWE today, someone who seems destined to be a world champion himself before long. So not only is his father the Janetty in one respect, but he's actually the Janetty in two respects. But at least Rick Steiner is remembered today, the same of which can't be said for our next subject in a lot of fans' minds. Yes, it's time to talk about the often forgotten half of the Smoking Guns, Bart Gunn. What's the story with this one? Well, back during mid-90s WWF, Vince McMahon, in his constant quest to give us wrestlers with jobs gimmicks, decided to introduce the world to a pair of rootin' tootin' cowboys. And this team would be made up of Billy and Bart Gunn. And while this was a cheesy gimmick, the Smoking Guns found a fair bit of success during their run together. Hell, with their at times manager Sonny by their side, they'd become 3-time WWF Tag Team Champions. Unfortunately though, once the duo ran its course toward the end of the decade, one of their members would not be able to find that same level of success again. And the reasons for this can largely be put down to Butterbean. Yes, unlike with other tag teams we've talked about today, there wasn't actually that big of a difference in the skill levels between Billy and Bart Gunn. So why did Billy go on to have such a successful run afterwards, all while his partner didn't? Well, that was because Billy was lucky enough to fall into a new pairing with the Road Dogg, a pairing known as the New Age Outlaws, which would go on to become one of the most decorated of its era. Meanwhile, as this was happening, Bart Gunn would find his career hobbled when, upon being entered into the Brawl for All, he went all the way to the final. And not only that, but he'd win the entire thing after last defeating Bradshaw. And so because he came out the victor, Bart would be put into a boxing match with Butterbean at WrestleMania 15. And at the showcase of the Immortals, Bart Gunn, an untrained boxer, would get absolutely demolished in a matter of seconds, with this pretty much ending any momentum he'd built up. And after that, he'd be forced to sit on the sidelines and watch as his former partner Billy went from strength to strength, at one point even nabbing some singles gold like the Intercontinental title. Hell, even to this day, Billy remains a star in places like AEW. And as for Bart, well, he's disappeared from the industry and, as such, has been forgotten by many modern fans. And that puts him in the same category as our next subject in many ways, someone who seemed primed to have it all at one point, but who ended up having nothing instead. Who are we talking about here? Why, former member of The Legacy, Ted DiBiase Jr., of course. Now, unlike most of the tag teams we've looked at today, when it comes to The Legacy, they actually had 3 members during the majority of their run, with these 3 members being none other than Randy Orton, Cody Rhodes, and Ted DiBiase Jr. Obviously, then, it shouldn't be hard to spot the odd man out here, as 2 of these men have become world champions, and one of them is Ted DiBiase Jr. How did things work out this way? Well, it really was just a case of the son of the $1 Million Man not clicking with fans in the way it was hoped he might when he was first introduced at the tail end of the 2000s. And because of this, even if he did become a two-time tag team champion with Rhodes specifically, he never had that aura of a guy who was going to break out in the singles division at any point. No, the reality of things is that even if you have a family lineage, there's no guarantee you're going to make it in the wrestling industry. People like David Flair, Eric Watts, and David Sammartino are perfect examples of this. So when the Legacy went their separate ways in 2010 then, it was always going to be an uphill battle for Ted DiBiase Jr. But then to be fair, it was also an uphill battle for Cody Rhodes in many ways too, as it took him a long time to really blossom into who he'd later become. In fact, it wouldn't be until he left WWE in 2016 and went on a vision quest across the Indies, which eventually led to him becoming a founding father of All Elite Wrestling in 2019, that he'd fully blossom into himself. And you all know what happened after that. A few years later, Cody would return to WWE and would go on to become the man who would ultimately beat Roman Reigns to end his 1,316-day run as undisputed WWE Universal Champion, with this making him the top guy in all of wrestling. Meanwhile, as he was doing this, Ted DiBiase Jr. would have long since left the industry behind, as following his exit from the Legacy, he'd do nothing but flounder in the mid-card for years, trying and failing to get things like the DiBiase Posse over with fans. Yes, the gulf between Ted and his two stablemates at this point has to be one of the widest the industry has ever seen, and that makes him one of the biggest Jannettys of all time. But is he a bigger Jannetti than our next subject? Well, let's find out now as we look at him, none other than Charlie Haas. That's right, we're going back to the early days of the Ruthless Aggression era, as that was when fans were first introduced to Charlie Haas and Shelton Benjamin, the duo collectively known as the World's Greatest Tag Team. What role did the World's Greatest Tag Team serve back then? Well, they were a pair of heavies for Kurt Angle, a pair who were often tasked with keeping the WWE title around their boss's waists at all costs. That said, this was far from all Benjamin and Haas were capable of. No, they were also more than ready to win some gold on their own, and that's exactly what led to them becoming tag team champions together on two separate occasions within WWE alone. And once the duo split up during the mid-2000s, things would not go so well for Charlie Haas, as he was almost immediately outshone by his partner. But then to be fair, when your partner is someone as talented as Shelton Benjamin, that's an easy trap to fall into. Yes, it was clear early on that WWE saw bigger things in the Gold Standard's future than they did the boy from Oklahoma, and so that was why, while Benjamin was doing things like winning the Intercontinental title and scoring pinfall victories over Triple H, Haas was struggling to stay above water by forming a new tag team with Rico. Needless to say then, this quickly led to Charlie being pegged as the Jannetti of the World's Greatest Tag Team, and once that happened, it was a case of when, not if, he was going to be cut from WWE altogether. When would that happen? Well, his first release would come in 2005, and while he would return again in the future, he would never even begin to approach the level Shelton Benjamin had reached, even if Benjamin had himself by this point hit something of a glass ceiling in WWE. So, as things stand today, one member of the World's Greatest Tag Team is seen as a bit of a working legend, and it's not Charlie Haas. No, while Haas does occasionally still wrestle for places like TNA, his stock has certainly dropped. As for his former partner though, well, he's currently in the midst of a run as part of the Hurt Syndicate in AEW. That's right, even this many years on, Charlie Haas just can't stop being reminded that he was the clear Jannetti of his team. And the same would go for another member of a popular Ruthless Aggression era duo if he tuned into AEW's sister promotion Ring of Honor today and there saw John Morrison doing his thing, making Joey Mercury all the less relevant as a result. Yes, it was back in 2005 that a new tag team hit the WWE main roster, one which went by the name of M&M. And the two main members of this team were none other than John Morrison and Joey Mercury. And this right there was where the problems began for the latter, because there was no world in which WWE were ever going to look at the two of them standing next to each other and think that the money was to be found in Mercury. So it was then that, while M&M would have a successful run together as a tag team, with them becoming three-time tag team champions before all was said and done, once it was all said and done, it was obvious who was going to be the breakout star. And that proved to be exactly how things played out when, once the two went their separate ways in 2006, John Morrison would have all the success. Yes, it was him who would go on to become a regular of things like the Money in the Bank ladder match, him who would have a successful run with The Miz, and him who would become a three-time Intercontinental Champion and one-time WWECW Champion. And once that was over, it would be him who went on to places like TNA, Lucha Underground, and AEW, and had even more success there, with him winning world titles in two of these promotions. As for Joey Mercury, well, he would not do any of these things. No, he would instead end up on the indie circuit for a while following the implosion of M&M, and when he finally did make it back to WWE a few years later, it wouldn't be in a featured role as a member of CM Punk's Straight Edge Society. Sure, Joey would get yet another run during the mid-2010s when he briefly became a member of J&J Security, Seth Rollins' personal security force, alongside Jamie Noble. But that was more of a comedy gimmick than anything else, and certainly not a sign of a career renaissance on his part or anything. And now that J&J Security has gone the way of the dodo, Joey Mercury has pretty much retreated from the industry entirely, with the last anyone saw of him being the time he spent in Ring of Honor back in 2019, where he served as a backstage producer. Will he ever get another run in the spotlight? It seems unlikely at this point. And so because of that, he's probably always going to go down as the Janetty of M&M, someone forever outshone by his more successful tag team partner. But then at least he's not alone in this, as like everyone else we've looked at today, he was unable to match his other half's success.